For most of us, hiking is an escape, a way to reconnect with nature, challenge our bodies, and clear our minds. But every once in a while, a simple hike can take a sinister turn. Today, we're going to explore a chilling tale of two friends, an ordinary trail, and a terrifying disappearance that defies explanation. It started out as a normal hiking trip, two lifelong friends venturing deep into the wilderness. They had planned a weekend hike on a well-known trail. It wasn't supposed to be difficult or dangerous, just a chance to get away from the noise of the city, catch up, and enjoy the peace and quiet of the mountains. They were seasoned hikers, and this trail wasn't anything out of the ordinary. No warnings, no stories of danger, just a scenic route through dense woods, leading to a breathtaking overlook. But this time, something was different. As the two friends pressed deeper into the forest, something shifted. It started with a slight feeling of unease, that subtle sensation that they weren't quite alone. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just their footsteps crunching along the narrow path. They joked about it at first. Maybe it was just the eerie stillness that forests sometimes bring. But as they moved forward, the feeling only grew stronger. By late afternoon, the trail had grown steeper, and the sun was dipping below the horizon. That's when they decided to take a quick break. One friend, let's call him the hiker, stayed behind to rest, while the other, the friend, stepped off the path to relieve himself in the bushes, promising to be back in a minute or two. A minute passed, then 2, then 5. At first, the hiker wasn't worried. Maybe his friend had gotten distracted by something in the woods, or maybe he'd wandered a little further off the trail than expected. But after nearly 10 minutes of silence, he started to grow uneasy. He called his friend's name again, louder this time, his voice echoing in the stillness of the forest. Nothing. Not a sound. The woods had swallowed his friend completely. His calls went unanswered, and the forest seemed to close in, the trees now feeling like silent sentinels hiding a terrible secret. He searched the immediate area, calling, yelling, thinking maybe his friend had slipped or wandered further than expected. But there was no sign of him. No footprints, no broken branches, just nothing. The sun was setting, and the forest was quickly becoming darker and more intimidating. Panic began to set in. His mind raced through every possibility. Had his friend gotten lost? Fallen somewhere out of sight? Or was it something worse? With no cell signal, the hiker made the only decision he could. He would hike back to the trailhead for help. But with every step away from where his friend had disappeared, a gnawing fear crept up on him. What if leaving was a mistake? What if he was abandoning his friend to some unknown danger? The hike back felt longer than it should have. The forest that once seemed peaceful now felt hostile, the trees casting long, threatening shadows. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something unseen was lurking just beyond the trail. After what felt like hours, he finally reached the trailhead and rushed to the nearest ranger station. The search party was assembled quickly, and they combed the forest well into the night, but despite their efforts, there was no trace of the friend. No clothing, no signs of a struggle, no footprints. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. The search continued for days, but no clues ever surfaced. The friend had disappeared without a trace, leaving only questions and a haunting sense of dread behind. To this day, the disappearance remains a mystery. The hiker was never the same after that. The woods, once a place of solace and adventure, had become a nightmare he couldn't escape. He would later tell close friends that, on some nights, he still hears his friend's voice echoing in the back of his mind, calling out from the woods, always calling, but never close enough to find. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway. Two friends, seasoned hikers, had planned a camping trip deep into the heart of the wilderness. The trail wasn't well known, perfect for an escape from crowded campgrounds and noisy tourists. They wanted isolation, and isolation is exactly what they found. After hours of hiking, they stumbled upon a clearing, an ideal spot to set up camp. Quiet, picturesque, and completely empty, or so it seemed. But as they were setting up, something caught their attention, just beyond the trees, a faint shape, almost hidden in the underbrush. It looked like another campsite. Curious, they decided to investigate. What they found was unsettling. There, tucked away behind a dense wall of trees, was another campsite. But this one was different. The fire was still smoldering, smoke lazily curling into the air, but there was no one around. Not a single person. At first, they thought the campers had gone for a hike. Maybe they'd return soon. But the more they looked, the stranger it became. The campsite felt wrong. There was an odd stillness in the air. The fire, the gear, the food, everything looked as if it had been left in a hurry. And yet, there was no sign of anyone. No footprints led away from the site. No rustling in the bushes. No distant voices or laughter. It was as though the campers had simply vanished. The eerie stillness made the hikers feel like they were intruding on something they shouldn't have discovered. They debated what to do next. Should they leave? Should they wait? Or should they just head back to their own camp and try to shake off the unsettling feeling? After all, people can be careless, right? Maybe the campers had rushed off and would be back soon. They convinced themselves it was nothing. But the forest didn't feel like nothing. Not anymore. As night fell, the sense of unease grew stronger. The distant crackling of their own fire did little to calm their nerves. They tried to joke about the situation, but every time the wind rustled through the trees, they found themselves glancing back toward the abandoned site. Then, just as they were starting to relax, they heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving through the forest, coming from the direction of the abandoned camp. They called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" But there was no response. Only the rustling of leaves, as if someone, or something, was moving just beyond the reach of their light. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. Silence. Absolute silence. The kind that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. It felt like they were being watched, but no matter where they shined their lights, there was nothing. No movement, no figures, just the impenetrable darkness of the woods. They decided not to investigate any further. Instead, they stoked their fire, trying to keep it burning bright, hoping the light would keep whatever was out there at bay. But even as they sat there, they couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still watching them from the shadows. As the night wore on, sleep became impossible. Every crack of a branch, every shift in the wind had them on edge. The abandoned campsite loomed large in their minds, as if it was somehow connected to whatever was lurking out there in the woods. By dawn, they had had enough. The strange events of the night, the unsettling stillness of the abandoned camp, it was too much. They packed up their gear and headed back down the trail, eager to leave the woods behind. But as they passed the abandoned site one last time, something stopped them in their tracks. The campsite was gone. The fire, the tents, the scattered belongings, everything had vanished. The clearing was empty, as if no one had ever been there. It was as though the forest had swallowed it whole, leaving behind nothing but the chilling memory of what they'd seen. The two hikers left in silence, their minds reeling. Had they imagined it all? Was the abandoned camp just a strange illusion, a trick of the forest? Or was there something far more sinister at play in those woods, something that didn't want to be found? To this day, no one knows what happened at that campsite. The two hikers never spoke of it again, but the memory lingers, an unsolved mystery hidden deep in the wilderness. Some say the forest holds on to its secrets, guarding them from the outside world, and sometimes those secrets reveal themselves when you least expect it. If you like the stories so far, please support us. Like, subscribe, and ring the bell icon. Now back to our final story. Our story begins with a hiking trip, something they had done many times before. For them, hiking wasn't just a hobby. It was a passion. The freedom of the trail, the thrill of exploring uncharted territory. There was no place they felt more at home. But this trip would be different. This time, something waited for them in the trees. It started like any other hike. A quiet morning, the cool air filling their lungs, the sound of birds in the distance. They were making good time, following a trail that twisted through the mountains. But as the day wore on, the path grew less familiar. It was then that they noticed something strange. The first sign was the silence, the kind of silence that makes you feel like the whole world is holding its breath. The birds had stopped singing. The wind no longer rustled the trees. It was as if the forest itself was waiting for something to happen. They pushed forward, convincing themselves it was just their imagination. After all, they had hiked this trail before. But as they walked, the forest seemed to change around them. The once well-marked path became overgrown, twisting in directions it hadn't gone before. And that's when they saw it, standing in the middle of the trail. A sign. Not an official marker, not something you'd expect to see on a well-traveled trail. No, this was different. Old, almost ancient, as if it had been there far longer than the path itself. There, scratched into the decaying wood, was a single word: warning. The rest of the message was hard to make out, bits and pieces of letters, as if someone had tried to carve out the warning only to be interrupted. But what remained was clear enough to chill the hiker to their core. Turn back. A cryptic warning, scratched into wood in the middle of nowhere. Most hikers would have turned around right then. But not this one. They were seasoned, experienced. Warnings like this were usually the work of pranksters, meant to spook tourists. So they pressed on, a decision that would haunt them for the rest of their life. The trail, if you could still call it that, became rougher. The underbrush thickened, the trees twisted unnaturally. Every step forward felt like an act of defiance against something unseen, something the forest didn't want them to find. That's when the feeling started. A cold, creeping sensation, like eyes boring into the back of their neck. They weren't alone anymore. Someone or something was watching them. They spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. No movement, no sound. Just the same eerie silence that had followed them since they passed the sign. But the feeling remained. Whatever it was close. By now, the sun was dipping below the horizon, the light fading fast. The hiker debated whether to continue or turn back, but a stubborn part of them refused to be scared off by an old, broken sign. They pressed on, though each step was slower, more hesitant. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. And then, just as they were beginning to think it was all in their head, they heard it. A whisper. It was faint, barely audible over the sound of their own breathing. But it was there, unmistakable. A voice, too far away to make out, but close enough to send a chill down their spine. They called out, their voice trembling, demanding to know who was there. But the whisper didn't respond. It just faded, leaving the forest in an even deeper silence. Now, fully dark, the hiker finally started to consider turning back. But just as they made up their mind, the voice returned, louder this time, closer. It was no longer just a whisper. It was a voice, raspy, echoing between the trees. And this time, they understood it. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't in their mind. Someone or something was out there and it wanted them gone. Terrified, they turned and ran, heart pounding, the words "before it's too late" echoing in their ears. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trail now barely recognizable. Branches reached out like twisted hands, the darkness suffocating. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a potential threat. But no matter how fast they ran, the feeling of being watched never faded. At last, they stumbled out of the forest, collapsing onto the ground, gasping for breath. The eerie silence was replaced by the familiar sounds of the night, crickets, the distant call of an owl. It was over. They had escaped, or so they thought. But when they reached their car, something strange caught their eye. There, tucked into their backpack, was a piece of the broken sign. "Turn back," it said, a final warning. But how had it gotten there? And more importantly, who had put it there? To this day, they don't know who or what was out there in the trees, whispering those warnings. But one thing is certain, they've never gone back to that trail, and they never will.